Berlin, April 1945. Nazi Germany was facing crushing defeat on every front, especially in the east. In the underground Führer bunker, Hitler ended his life with a pistol. His death marked the complete collapse of the totalitarian regime. Above ground, the Red Army had reached Tiergarten. Every 10 minutes, another barrage of artillery. The women who had once lived in grand mansions, the wives of Nazi leaders, now sat huddled in worn wool coats. In their hands, a vial of cyanide or a torn piece of paper. These were their final words before surrendering to fate. They had once lived in luxury, beside the most infamous figures of the Nazi regime. Now, with the collapse, their husbands were either dead or captured, leaving them to face only ash and despair. Magda Goebbels whispered to her eldest daughter, "We won't let the Russians touch you." Eva Braun had been Hitler's wife for just 36 hours. She ended her life with him in his study. The room fell silent, with only the radio playing Lily Marlene in the background. In Demmin, many women were found lifeless along the banks of the Peene River. In fear and chaos, they chose desperate ends. In Kiel, Admiral Friedeberg's wife took her own life shortly after he signed the surrender of the German Navy. Within days, the entire class of powerful wives unraveled. Ilse Hess, Emmy Goering, and Margarete Speer were arrested and interrogated in cold, barren rooms. Hedwig Rosenberg faced the Red Army, eventually imprisoned in the Soviet Union. Her entire estate was confiscated. Lena Heydrich burned documents and fled to the island of Fehmarn, but none of them escaped. Her villa was sealed. Her son, Haider, was investigated for years. This is the story of the women at the edge of the Reich. Once surrounded by the splendor of Nazism, they were cast out, left to live in isolation. Their fate stands as proof. Power is fleeting. Consequences are enduring. This account will retrace their final hours, their desperate decisions, and the pain of post-war life, a sharp incision into history. The Red Army swept into Berlin, tearing through every street. Machine guns roared, grenades exploded, and buildings collapsed like dominoes. Soviet artillery pounded without pause, ripping rooftops apart and reducing grand boulevards to heaps of rubble. Thick smoke choked the air, mixed with the stench of gunpowder and death. The water supply system had collapsed. Pipes were shattered. Clean water was gone. Power had completely failed, and darkness swallowed the city. Food was nearly exhausted. Civilians scrambled for scraps of dry bread. People hid in basements and bomb shelters, huddled together, trembling. Children clung to their mothers, their eyes vacant. Some took their chances, darting through the ruins with bundles of clothes. But the Red Army had blocked every escape route. Once majestic avenues were now littered with burned-out vehicles and the horrific remnants of death. Cries echoed from the ruins of collapsed homes. Berlin, once a proud capital, had become a vast death trap. Chaos and fear clung to every corner. Beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery, the Führer bunker stood as the final fortress. Concrete walls 3 meters thick. Steel doors bolted shut. Narrow corridors like tunnels. Small rooms, meeting chambers, bedrooms, storage were reinforced against bombs. This was where Adolf Hitler and his inner circle withdrew, facing the end. Inside, the air was heavy and damp, thick with diesel fumes from the howling generators. Dim bulbs hung from wires, casting a yellowish light over pale faces. Shadows moved slowly like wandering ghosts. Bomb blasts from above rumbled through the structure, shaking the very bricks. Martin Bormann crushed a map in his hands, clutching his head in despair. Officials whispered, their voices trembling, speaking of plans that no longer mattered. Guards clutched their rifles, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Secretaries hunched over their desks, hands shaking as explosions drew closer. Fear crept in like smoke, suffocating what little hope remained. Some stared at shredded maps, useless scraps of paper. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. Defeat was at the door. From the heights of absolute power, the Führer bunker had become a concrete tomb, burying the last illusions of the Third Reich. Just beyond the hallway, the wives of high-ranking military officials sat quietly in their private rooms, waiting for orders or for fate. Adolf Hitler, once the leader of a powerful empire, now cowered inside the Führer bunker. His health had deteriorated. Sunken eyes, ashen skin, hands trembling uncontrollably. Even the treatments meant to sustain him had lost their effect. Sleep had nearly vanished, replaced by long, restless nights. Hitler screamed at his generals, blaming them for the collapse. "Treachery!" he shouted into their faces, voice hoarse, breathing heavy. Battle reports piled up on his desk. The Red Army was just a few kilometers away. German forces were disintegrating. Berlin was burning. Each document was another blow confirming total defeat. He slammed the table, tore apart maps, but the truth remained unshaken. His mind was in constant turmoil, clinging to delusions of some vague, secret weapon. One moment he mumbled about victory. The next, he collapsed into his chair in deep silence. Outbursts of rage alternated with dead quiet. The man who once commanded a nation could no longer control himself. On April 29th, 1945, in that stifling air, a strange ceremony took place. Adolf Hitler, head of the Third Reich, married Eva Braun, his longtime discreet companion. In a dimly lit meeting room, the yellow light cast heavy shadows across the couple's faces. Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and a few aides stood as silent witnesses. Eva, wearing a simple black dress, managed a faint smile. Hitler's hand shook as he signed the marriage certificate. There were no flowers, no music, no words of celebration, only the hum of the generators and the distant thunder of bombs. The ceremony was brief, lasting less than 10 minutes. A glass of wine was passed around, but no one raised it in a toast. Eva had once dreamed of splendor. Now she became Hitler's wife in the final hours of life. The act, set against the backdrop of collapse, felt theatrical, a desperate attempt to retain some fragment of control. A wedding at the end of the world, like a final flash of light before darkness consumes all. That same night, Hitler sat in his study, his gaze vacant. He read aloud his final will and testament, voice hoarse, hand gripping the pen tightly. Secretary Traudl Junge typed as he spoke. Each keystroke sounded like a countdown. His hand trembled, but his voice was strangely calm. Junge recalled in her 2002 memoir, "I couldn't tell if it was composure or despair." Hitler refused to surrender, his tone defiant. He blamed the failure on his officers, refusing to admit any fault. He declared he would never be captured alive, choosing a tragic end over the humiliation of defeat. The testament was divided into two parts. The political portion appointed Donitz as his successor. The personal portion left his meager assets to his family and closest aides. Every sentence carried the weight of obstinance. Even with Berlin in ruins, he still clung to the ideals of the regime. 3 copies of the testament were made. Hitler ordered them delivered to Munich, to Karl Donitz, his chosen successor, and to the last remaining military units. It was a final attempt to preserve a sense of post-war control. The papers were signed, folded, and locked in a metal case. Everyone in the room stood silent, watching Hitler. That document was his last self-deception, a desperate grasp at twisted honor to avoid confronting guilt. But it was merely an empty echo of a dead empire. By the afternoon of April 30th, Soviet artillery was deafeningly close. The Führer bunker shook violently. Inside his private study, Eva and Hitler faced each other in their final moments. Eva lifted the cyanide capsule to her mouth and collapsed into the chair within seconds. Hitler then ended his life with a gunshot. Moments later, aide Otto Gunsche opened the door. The room was thick with the stench of gunpowder. Hitler's body lay sprawled, unrecognizable. Ava sat pale in the chair. The cyanide capsule rolled beneath her feet. The aides quickly wrapped the bodies in gray wool blankets and dragged them down the narrow hallway. They carried the corpses to the garden of the Reich Chancellery, only meters from the advancing Red Army. Machine gun fire whistled overhead. Smoke clouded the air. Gasoline was poured over the two bodies. Flames ignited instantly, consuming fabric and flesh. The aides abandoned the scene and rushed back into the bunker. That cremation marked the final moment of a regime that had lasted 12 years. It was a last-ditch effort to prevent capture by the Soviets and to avoid the scorn of history. But ashes cannot erase crimes. At the same time, Magda Goebbels held her 6 children close. They nestled against their mother, innocent in the darkness. Their small faces, each name beginning with an H, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, Heidrun, echoed like the final notes of a shattered illusion. Magda, once a powerful First Lady of the Reich, was now a trembling shadow. She stroked their hair and whispered fairy tales, but her eyes were cold, filled with the resolve of an ending. She knew Berlin had fallen. The Red Army was only steps away. Her husband, Joseph Goebbels, fiercely loyal to Hitler, refused to surrender. Magda looked at her children, those pure, trusting faces, and saw no way out. She would not let them fall into enemy hands. On May 1st, 1945, Magda carried out a horrifying act. She led each child one by one into a private room. In her hand was a vial of cyanide. The children believed their mother was giving them sleeping medicine. One by one, they drifted into eternal sleep. Magda stood over them, her face stone-like, tears streaming down. The act, cold and merciless, was the final expression of blind loyalty. Afterward, Magda and Joseph walked together into the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Joseph shot Magda in the head, then took his own life. Their bodies collapsed beside the prepared cans of gasoline. An aide poured fuel over them and lit the flames. The fire roared, erasing all trace. The survivors walked away in silence, carrying the horror with them. The Goebbels family, in their brutal end, left the final wound in the fantasy of a fallen regime. Just like Magda, the fates of other powerful women were no less tragic. Lena Heydrich, widow of the butcher of Prague, Reinhard Heydrich, stood silent in her cold villa in 1945. Her husband had been assassinated in 1942. Now, as the Red Army approached, Lena burned all documents and files. The ashes were a desperate attempt to erase the traces of a blood-soaked past. She hastily packed belongings and fled Prague with her 3 young children. The road to Bavaria was treacherous, each step shadowed by fear. Eventually, she brought the children to Fehmarn Island, their former home. Her assets were investigated, her villa sealed off. Allied forces interrogated her, labeling her a collaborator for her blind loyalty to her husband. Lena lived in seclusion, but never in silence. In 1976, she published her memoir, My Life with a War Criminal. In it, she tried to restore Heydrich's reputation, portraying him as a devoted husband. The book sold well, turning her into someone who lived off the haunted legacy of atrocity. Though she escaped capture, the crimes of the old regime clung to her. Inescapable, indelible. The wife of Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg met a different end. On May 7, 1945, her husband signed Germany's naval surrender to the Allies. Unable to bear the disgrace, he chose to take his own life. Shortly afterward, she took cyanide and collapsed in silence. Some sources claim they drank the poison together, as a final farewell. Death was instant, a declaration of loyalty, or a refusal to accept defeat. Historical records offer little about her. Only a lifeless figure remains amid the rubble of the fallen Reich. Margaret Speer, wife of Albert Speer, once lived lavishly among the elite of the regime. When Berlin fell, she was arrested by Allied forces. The interrogation room was freezing, with relentless questions about her husband's role. Unlike Magda, she survived, but her life was turned upside down. Her property was confiscated. Her status vanished. In post-war society, she was shunned. Contempt followed her everywhere. Margaret withdrew from public life, the weight of the past pressing down on each passing day. Her husband, after years in prison, admitted partial responsibility, but she never did. She chose silence. That survival, in the end, became a lifelong sentence of isolation. In Demmin and Neustrelitz, horrifying scenes unfolded. They believed the terrifying broadcasts from German radio that the Red Army would torture, destroy, and violate everything. The fear was planted by those who had already vanished. Thousands of women and children chose a tragic end. They turned to death in many forms: poison, hanging, even plunging into rivers. Countless bodies floated, tangled in the cold current. Inside the homes, the images were haunting. Mothers clutching their children, hands gripping family keepsakes, wedding photos, old insignias. The streets were saturated with the stench of decay, and a heavy gloom settled over everything. From the Goebbels villa to the rivers of Demmin, these women, in one way or another, fell under the shadow they once revered. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The Allies launched an aggressive manhunt. They turned over every stone in search of evidence of the regime's crimes, networks of hiding places, looted treasures. The goal was clear: punish collaborators and purge the remnants of the old government. The wives who once lived in luxury were now dragged into the light. Homes were searched, files were torn apart. No one escaped the net of justice. Ilse Hess, wife of Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, was arrested by the British in Bavaria. Her husband had been imprisoned since 1941 after his mysterious solo flight to the UK, leaving Ilse alone. In the interrogation room, officers pressed her on her role in the party. Ilse remained silent. Her eyes were cold, unwavering in loyalty to her husband. She was never convicted, but from that point on, Ilse was barred from public life. She lost her right to vote and was placed under strict surveillance. She continued writing letters, advocating for Hess's release. Within her, the ideals of the regime had never collapsed. That blind loyalty, like a chain, bound her for life. Emmy Goering, once the unofficial First Lady, had lived in opulence beside Hermann Goering. When American troops stormed the Berchtesgaden villa, they pulled her from beneath piles of glittering jewelry. Emmy tried to hide a few diamonds, but it was no use. All her possessions, priceless paintings, gold, were confiscated. In the detention camp, she faced a barrage of questions about treasures looted from Holocaust victims. After her release, Emmy lived in poverty, scorned by society. Hedwig Rosenberg, wife of Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg, wasn't spared by the Red Army. She was taken to a gulag camp in Soviet territory. Years of forced labor slowly broke her body. Her wealth vanished. Her family was torn apart. Hedwig survived, but life itself had become a sentence of exile. In that place, destruction sometimes seemed easier to bear than survival. But it wasn't only the prominent names. Many other wives, rarely mentioned, also fell into the hands of the victors. Allied detention camps, from Britain's Bad Nendorf to France's Cherche Midi, were cold and unforgiving. Damp canvas tents, surrounded by barbed wire. Meals were meager, just bread and thin soup. Wives connected to the old regime were separated from their children, subjected to prolonged interrogations. The questions were sharp as blades, probing every fragment of memory. When released, they returned to a shattered society. Many were forced to take menial jobs, living quietly under watchful, suspicious eyes. Some continued to defend their husbands, clinging to the remnants of old beliefs. They were not executed. They didn't take their own lives, but their existence carried scars that could never be erased. The Red Army, carrying the scars of war, unleashed its fury on those connected to the fallen regime. In the occupied zones, rage turned into brutal violence. Women with any perceived ties, whether as wives of officials or civilians, who had supported the regime, became targets of retribution. Soldiers stormed into homes, shattered doors, and dragged women into the streets. They were subjected to rough treatment and public humiliation. Screams pierced the night, mixed with the chaos of occupying units. Many were assaulted in front of crowds, their clothes torn from their bodies. In villages near Königsberg, women met tragic ends in desperate attempts to escape disgrace. Some threw themselves into rivers, mothers holding their children in their arms. Keepsakes like wedding rings and faded insignias lay scattered in the mud. The fear had been magnified by the regime itself, then collided with the Red Army's fury, creating a nightmare with no escape. The Soviet Gulag system was a frozen hell. Camps stretched from Siberia to Kazakhstan. Rotten wooden barracks with broken roofs let the cold wind howl through. Prisoners huddled on dirt floors under tattered blankets, shivering in sub-zero temperatures. Food consisted of moldy, black bread, watery cabbage soup, sometimes laced with grit. Water was drawn from melting snow, cloudy and barely drinkable. Forced labor lasted 14 to 16 hours a day, breaking rocks, felling trees, dragging timber through swamps. Hands bled, nails broke, bodies gave out. Discipline was enforced through violence. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Disease spread quickly, and mortality rates were high. Emaciated figures collapsed into the snow, later dumped into mass graves. Women were separated from their children. Some lost their minds, murmuring in corners. Survival was not a release. It was a drawn-out crushing of both body and soul. The rest were pushed into a new system, colder, quieter, and even more unforgiving. The world turned its eyes to Nuremberg. There, international justice laid bare the full extent of the Third Reich's crimes. The courtroom echoed with accusations. Press cameras flashed relentlessly. The fallen leaders faced the gallows or lengthy prison sentences. But their wives received a different kind of sentence, one handed down by public opinion and conscience. They lived close to the heart of justice, yet their trials were silent, a process without verdict, one that weighed heavier with each passing day. Emmy Goering, once the unofficial First Lady, now lived in a guarded house near Nuremberg. She pleaded to see Hermann Goering, but the Allied guards coldly denied her. Emmy wandered near the courthouse in secret, her face hidden behind a scarf, avoiding the press cameras. Every letter she wrote to her husband was censored. On October 14th, 1946, Hermann Goering ended his life with cyanide just hours before his scheduled execution. Emmy heard the news over the radio. She fell into a state of paralyzed grief. Margaret Himmler, wife of Heinrich Himmler, was held near Nuremberg and subjected to extended interrogation. When questioned about the concentration camps and the mass murder plan, she continued to insist her husband was innocent. Her tone was rigid. She claimed to know nothing about the Holocaust. Released in early 1946, Margaret lived in constant anxiety. She was frequently threatened by civilians and anti-groups. Margaret Speer, wife of Albert Speer, watched as her husband admitted moral responsibility in court. After his 20-year sentence, she was allowed to visit him, separated by cold iron bars. She raised their children alone, living beneath the shadow of his crimes. The authorities kept her under strict surveillance. Society viewed her with scorn. While Albert Speer stood before justice, Margaret bore an unnamed sentence, a quiet life marked by the label, wife of a war criminal. Their children rejected the legacy. Many changed their names, emigrated to the United States, Canada, or South America, trying to escape the shadow of their parents. Some wrote memoirs, but most chose silence. The legacy of the old regime didn't just destroy the parent generation, it left its mark on the living, pulling them into obscurity or into a fragile life spent forever fleeing the past. Whether they participated directly or remained in the shadows, these women were an inseparable part of the regime's machinery of destruction. They benefited from status, power, and a life of luxury built on the suffering of others. They supported, or at the very least, turned a blind eye to, the horrific crimes of the regime. History will never forgive those who stood in the shadows of power, even if they never pulled a trigger or gave a direct order. The story of Magda Goebbels, who caused the tragic deaths of her own children, or Emmy Goering, who denied and dismissed all wrongdoing, is chilling evidence. Loyalty to an individual or a brutal ideology can lead to moral collapse, turning people into instruments of inhumanity. Many of them, such as Margaret Himmler or Lena Heydrich, lived in persistent denial, trying to whitewash the past or justify the crimes. But historical truth always has its answer. It cannot be buried by silence or lies. No matter how much time passes, the scars left by those crimes remain, permanent and unerasable. Any regime built on hatred, violence, and deception is destined for a tragic end. The story of the wives of the Third Reich stands as a chilling reminder of humanity's darkness, of the madness of fanaticism, and of the price paid when conscience is smothered by power and illusion.